This is just a quick tutorial on how to achieve this particular effect that you see here. I initially thought I could make it in After Effects, but I just think it's a lot easier to put together in Cinema 4D. But yeah, basically creating a 3D shape and then running a texture along the outside surface of it. Now, at first it looks pretty simple, but you can see that as the red text goes over the back, there's actually a kind of a gray version of it as well. So we're going to actually need to render out two versions of this text being projected and run along the outside texture of this 3D shape. One that is this gray, and then one that is red. And the red one will just go around the front surface, but the gray one over here is actually going to run along the entire shape. So if we jump into Photoshop, this is what our textures are going to look like. Very simple. Just some text. Here are our text layers, and we have two versions or a duplicate of this same file. One that has the red version of the text and one that has the gray version of the text. And I've made this text texture quite large. We go to the size of it here. You can see that it's 2200 by 2000. We want a pretty high resolution image because it's going to be raster, and we don't want it to pixelate when it's on the 3D shape, because we're ultimately going to render it out at 1080 by 1920 so that it works on a phone screen. So we're going to need this to be pretty high resolution. Okay, so we have our red version, we have our white version, and we're going to be using those in Cinema 4D later. Once we get those rendered out textures into After Effects, it's going to look like this. So I've actually got a mask in here which will turn off temporarily, and you can see the two layers that we'll be rendering out. So we'll be rendering out this gray version which wraps around this 3D shape, and that's going to go the whole way around. And then we'll also be rendering out a version of the red text that is only visible in the front. Okay, so it'll only be on that front surface of the shape, and we won't see it go around the back. And then we'll combine them together so you can see what that looks like. And in the actual example that we've got here, you can see that they've included just a matte or a mask here, so that as that red text goes over the back, it just kind of fades out on that edge. I think it actually looks, more interesting, more visually interesting like this, but to achieve the full effect, we'll be adding in that mask as well. So we'll just take our gray layer here, and then we'll use a track matte of this particular mask. If we undo that, you can just see what the mask looks like. It's just a very basic mask with a feathered edge. Okay, and then the ultimate effect will be this right here. Okay, so let's jump into Cinema 4D and get started on this. Alright, so this is essentially what it's going to look like in Cinema 4D. If we play that back. And the way that we're achieving that is by adding our texture onto our lofted object. I'll show you how to set this up in a second. And then on the texture itself, we are animating the offset of that texture. You can see if I drag this offset here, it just animates the positioning of that texture on the outside surface of that shape. Okay, so let's get into a new file here. We'll start by just making the 3D shape itself. I thought the easiest way to do this would just be to start with a circle, and then we'll make it editable. We'll go to edge mode, and we will delete this bottom point. And you can see it's trying to close the full shape here. So we can uncheck close spline, go back to object mode, we'll move that up, and then we'll control click and drag this shape here to duplicate it, and we'll rotate that around 180 degrees. And then what we can do is go back to edge mode, go to our spline pen, and just link those up. And then we can take this shape, and then again, if we go to our move tool, we'll control click and drag to duplicate, And then what we can do is we can create a loft and then just drop these two shapes here into the loft. Two things we want to adjust here. We don't want this face visible. You'll see if we go back to our example here, there is no face on this side. It's just the shape, and there's kind of a hole that goes through it. So we'll jump back. So we're going to click on our loft, go to caps, and remove those start and end caps. You can see, we can see right through. You can also see if we zoom in here, it's a bit blocky. So we can add a bit more geometry there to get rid of that blockiness. So on the loft, we can go back to the object panel here and bump that up. You can see we can increase that value there until it's nice and smooth. So maybe we'll do 60. If you don't find it smooth enough, then you can obviously increase that a little bit more. So there's our shape. We can then put a camera in here because we need to get the right angle. So I'll go to camera, and you can use whatever camera you need. I'm going to go with a Redshift camera. You could probably do this with isometric. Let's just keep it simple. So cameras, we'll just use an isometric view here to kind of approximate the angle from the video. And then we'll take this object and we'll just rotate it. Degrees like that. Hopefully this is the right angle, but we can always adjust that later. Something like this. So now we have our loft. Now we can actually get our texture in here. So down the bottom here, and I'm in the standard workspace here. So I'm actually using a legacy layout because I prefer having all of these buttons at the top here. But yeah, so I'm just going to add my textures in here. If you don't see this texture panel visible, you can go to Window, and you can go to Material Manager over here, and that's this little area down the bottom. I'm just going to double click, create this material. I'm going to drag this material onto my shape, and I'll double click on my material. Maybe just scale this down a little bit so we can kind of see our shape as well. So we'll have something like this. And for the first part, we're going to just bring in our gray text. So that's the gray texture. If we jump back to Photoshop, it's this one here. So the gray version we'll make first, and then we'll make our red texture to apply to our shape. So the gray one, I'm just going to drag a copy in here. I exported out a Photoshop file so it would have that transparency built in. So there's my Photoshop file. Drag that out a little bit. And then this I'm going to initially just connect to color so we can see what it's doing. And we'll render this just to see what we've got so far. So Shift R will just render it to the picture viewer. And you can kind of see what it's doing. You can see it's not respecting the transparency that exists in that Photoshop file. So we actually need to use another node to get it to respect that, so it doesn't kind of render this out as a black material with gray text on it. We actually want it to be a transparent material with gray text on it. So we're going to need to add a color splitter in here. So if we click this plus button, we can search for color splitter, and we'll double click that. And then instead of our texture going straight into the color of the Redshift standard material, instead we'll just connect it to this input on the color splitter, and we'll also connect it to the color for now. We'll change that in a second. And then for this color splitter here, we want to have the out A go into the opacity, and that way it's going to actually respect the alpha channel that's in there. And you'll see it actually updates the thumbnail. So you can see now we have what we wanted. Before it was a black material with the white text on it, but now we have a transparent material with the white text on it. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. You can see now it's actually respecting that transparency, and we actually have that gray text on a transparent background wrapped along that shape. All right, now if I jump back there, the issue with that is you can kind of see here that there are actually shadows still on this text. You can see at the top here there's a little bit of a shadow, there's a little bit of a highlight, but we want this to look like a flat color, almost like it's a constant flat color. We don't want there to be shadows on this if we want to kind of make it match the original example. And so instead of piping this into the color, we're actually going to connect it to the emission color instead. And you'll see initially it doesn't look right, it looks kind of gray. So we have to just adjust a couple things first. So we need to change the color here. Because we're connecting this to the emission color, we're not actually using the diffuse or the base color here. So this weight can be set to 0. And now it's going to look weird again, so we actually have to go down here. Because we connected it into the emission, we have to go to that emission property there and set that weight to 1. Actually, not 2, 1. And now if we render that again, although it looks odd in the viewport there, it will now render correctly. It'll render as a flat gray color, which is the original color of the text in our Photoshop file, instead of having shadows and highlights on it. So you can see it's nice and flat. All right, so that material is now set up. Now we can make our red material. So our red material will be more or less the same. Let's just control click and drag this and make the second one. So the first one will be gray text and the second one. All right, on this red version, we're going to do this slightly differently because we actually don't even need the color splitter here, and we don't need this Redshift standard material either. So we can actually delete these two. Actually, we can delete that as well. We'll drag in our red texture, our red text texture, which is this one here. So you can see the red text, and we'll actually out this color straight into the output initially. Okay, and this will keep that red text flat. The issue here, though, you'll see if I render this. Oh, I haven't applied the material yet. So we actually need to swap this material out. So drag this red material here and replace the material on our loft with that red one. Okay, so you'll see now if we render this, so let's actually do this with our render view instead. So Redshift render view, bring that up, press play. You'll see currently this is what we have. So our text is the wrong way around, but we have managed to pipe it straight into the output, and that means the text is going to be a flat color, and it's not going to have a gradient on it or look like it's affected by light and reflections and things like that. Okay. The other issue is that we have this, a bit of that text coming around the back, which we do not want. Now, to get rid of that text around the back, we'll kind of start there. So to get the text to only be on the front face here, we need a ray switch. So we'll add in a ray switch here. And we'll connect this out color to the camera color and connect the out of the ray switch to the surface. Let's move this over here so we can see what we've done. Right. Now on the ray switch, you'll see once I click on this enable front back, it's going to hide what it thinks is the back face. Now, the reason it thinks this is the back face is actually the order of the shapes in the loft. This is an easy mistake to make. So if when you connect into the color, and you'll see here there's two options actually. Into the camera you have the color and you have the back face color. So when you plug it into the color, it should actually make this gray shape fill this space here. You'll see if I put it into the wrong side here, put it into the back face, that's what we're supposed to be getting. But right now it's kind of treating the front as if it's the back face, which we don't want. So instead we'll fix this node. So plug this into the color, not the back face. So the color. Now it thinks this front face is the back face, and all you need to do here is swap the order of these two shapes here in your loft. And now it will treat it correctly. So now it recognizes that this is the front face, and that is actually the back face inside of the shape. So this little space inside there. Okay. So now what we want to do is make that transparent. We don't actually want this gray shape in here, obviously. Now you'd think it would be simple. You'd think you could just go to this back face color, which is the face inside this shape here, that it's made gray, that gray there. And if you go here, you can change the color of this, make it a bit brighter if you want. Obviously you don't want that. You want that to be transparent. And you'd think that if you just drag this alpha to 0, it would fix it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. What we're going to need to do is rather pipe in a completely transparent material into this back face color, instead of trying to rely on the limited options here. So back in here, we'll go and search for material. Let's create a regular material here. We'll connect the out of this material to this ray switch, and we're connecting it into that back face color because that's whatever the color this back face inside here is. So back face color, you'll see it'll make that back face. Now you can kind of see it makes a bit more sense because of the reflections. But obviously we want that to be transparent. So on this material, we'll set its diffuse color, this gray, to 0, so it has no diffuse. And then down here, it looks like it's solved, but it's not really. You can see this is the actual color of the material. So if we render this out, we'll get this red text on the front, but we'll get a kind of a black shape on the side here, where that back face is. So we actually need to go down here to refraction, set refraction to 1. You'll see our material will update. Now it's glassy, but it's still got a reflection on it. We don't want it to look like it has a glass interior or a glass back face. So we'll need to change the reflection to 0 because we don't want that reflection there. So reflection to 0. It's almost fully transparent. You can see that we're still getting a little bit of the material coming through here. The last thing is just to click on thin walled, and then we get a completely translucent material here. And then that's kind of solved. So yeah, now we're using a transparent material for the back face, and we're using our red text for the front face, using this ray switch. So now if I render this out in our render viewer, so not just in the Redshift one because we can't really see what we're doing there. So we'll hit Shift R, and you can see the background is black, and even if I click on this image transparency here, we can't see that transparent background, and that's because we haven't actually rendered the scene with an alpha channel. So Cinema 4D is automatically exporting out a scene with a black background. We want it to be a transparent background. So we just need to go to our render settings here and turn on, under save, turn on alpha channel, and we want a straight alpha. We'll close that. And if we click Shift R again to render, and we click on here, image transparency, now it actually works. Now you can see we're actually rendering out just the red text on a transparent background. Okay, so that's the slightly more difficult of the two materials, but those are now done, and that's the hard work over. So we can close this now, we can close this material, close the Redshift viewer, and obviously we need to now just add a little bit of animation in here for each of these two materials. So that animation isn't going to happen on the materials themselves, it'll happen on this material tag here, on this offset U value. So you'll see if I drag offset U, it's going to drag that around, and we do actually need to flip around this text. Let's just check something here. So our gray text is identical, same orientation. That's fine. All we need to do on the tag here to fix the orientation of this text so it's actually readable is to change our tile U value here to a negative. And let's see if we put the gray text and replace it. Perfect. Okay, so we'll actually we'll add the animation first, and then we'll duplicate it. So we have a red text version and a gray text version. So we'll click on this material tag. Everything is oriented correctly, and now we can set where we want this offset U to actually begin. So maybe, yeah, we're going to start it. Yeah, we can just start it right there. So on frame 0, add a keyframe, and then obviously before we add our keyframe in here, our second keyframe, we just want to make sure that our frame rate is correct. So we're going to press Control D to bring up our project settings. You'll see our frame rate here is set to 30 frames per second. If you look at the reference, it's actually at a lower frame rate. It's not at 24 frames per second. It's actually at about 12 frames per second. It's almost like they've kind of posterized time a bit there. So we will do the same thing. So we'll set our frames per second to 12 for our project. Now we have 36 frames down here. And then in our render settings as well, under output, we need to match the frame rate. So if our project frame rate is 12, our render frame rate, we also want that to be 12. And then we can set our frame range here to all frames. So it renders all the frames in our timeline, which is 36 frames. We can also, while we're here, set the width and height. So this should actually be 1080 by 1920. That's all correct. Can zoom in a bit. And then now we can get back to setting our keyframes. So on this tag, we click on the tag. We've set a keyframe on offset U at 0. And now we can just go to frame 36 and then drag this up. To kind of end there, let's say. And we'll keyframe that. And if we play that back, there's a little bit of animation. This isn't the exact timing of the animation, so you always want to go to the scene playback settings here and uncheck all frames. We wanted to use the scene frame rate to play back these frames so we can get a good sense of the timing. So that's the actual timing, 3 seconds, and you can see the easing is built in there. Alright, so there's our animation setup, and you can see that even if I drag and drop this red version of the material onto that tag, the animation remains intact. So now I can actually control click and drag this loft, make a duplicate version, and on the other version, I'll have my gray text. So I have my gray text version, you can see it has its keyframes, and then if I click on the red text version, it has its keyframes as well. And if I hide this, then we have our gray text version. And if I hide the other one, so we have like our little traffic lights here, if we hide that, then we have our red version. And we want to render out each of these. So like we had in our render settings here, we are having it, we've set it to render out 12 frames per second, 36 frames, so that's 3 seconds of animation. And then choose where we want to save it. So I've set mine just to save it to my desktop into a folder, and then the files will be called Stranger Red for for the red text and then stranger gray for the gray text. So make sure that you've got this set on TIFF. You're going to render with an alpha channel, straight alpha, and under output here, make 100% sure that your framing is correct here, and your resolution, and your frame rate. And then this should be set to all frames, or set it to 36 frames like we have down at the bottom here. 36 frames, keyframe on frame 0 and frame 36. Alright, let's see what this looks like. So if I hit Shift R, see what the final framing looks like. I'll just change that positioning a bit. If you want to see this a little bit better, you can actually create a camera. So let's create a standard camera. And then you can see if you click on this little icon here, you'll be able to see the actual framing. And we want to frame this so that the edge of the text here, when the text is at its longest, is the same distance between this edge and that left edge and the left edge of this object here. So let's find where the text is the longest. So that's over here. Something like that, and we can actually move it up as well to kind of match the original. Let's hit Shift R to see the framing. Looks correct. And we'll just let that render. And then we'll do the same for the gray text. Okay, so all of our frames are rendered. Now we can render out our gray version. So we'll hide this and unhide the gray version. And hit Shift R. Wait, before we do that, we need to change the file name. Otherwise we'll overwrite those other red layers. So change this here to gray and close that. Hit Shift R to render the gray versions. Let's let that go in the background and then we'll continue. Okay, all of our frames are now rendered out. We can actually jump into After Effects and we can complete this process. Alright, so let's import our image sequences. We'll start with the gray text, and we're importing that as footage, TIFF sequence, and import. We're going to choose straight, because that's how we rendered it out from Cinema 4D. That's for our alpha channel, so we'll press OK. And we're going to drag that onto a new composition. Okay, and you can see that we have a little bit of an issue here. The composition duration looks incorrect. You can see it's only like just over a second, and it should be 3 seconds long. So let's undo that. We're going to right click on this image sequence here and go to Interpret Footage Main. And you'll see that it's assumed that the frame rate is 30. Ours is 12. So we'll just need to set that to 12 and press OK. And then we'll drag this onto a new composition. And now you can see it's 3 seconds long. And now we can import our red text. So let's double click here. Let's find our red text layers. And you can see I actually have 2 sets here. So this is the correct one for me. So it's that one. I'll press import straight unmatted, press OK. Again, the frame rate won't be correct, so we need to go to Interpret Footage Main and set this frame rate to 12. Press OK. And then we can drag this red text version of our image sequence into our scene. And if we play this back, You zoom in there, you can see that the red text is perfectly over the gray text that was there. So if I uncheck that, so that's almost finished being set up. The last thing that we might want to do here is maybe just introduce that mask at the top there, so that when the text goes over the top here, instead of the gray text going all the way down this back face here, it'll just kind of fade out at about there. So we'll create a black block here, and I think we want it to be about that size. That. And then we can add a mask to this layer. So layer, mask, new mask. And under the mask settings here, we'll just feather that path on the Y. That. And we don't want that feathered edge at the top there. So we can maybe just drag these up a little bit higher. Okay, so this will be our matte. It's just a black block with a feathered edge. And then we will go to our gray text here and then set that track matte to this block. Let's go back to that matte. We might need to just adjust the feathering on it. And that up a little bit, something like that maybe. Okay, frame that back up. And lay it back. Okay, and at this point, depending on what we want to do here, like I kind of feel like we don't really want to see this gray text here kind of interfering in the middle. So we might actually move this a little bit further up just for our example, because our camera angle is slightly different to the original example. That up maybe to like, see what that looks like up there. There. Down a bit. Balance. Actually, that looks better. Okay, and that's it. That is the completed effect. Thanks for watching.